Assalamu alaikum students. This is lecture number 24. It's about the definition of poetry and subject matter of poetry from Paraphrase to Lyrical Ballads. Lecture number 22, we talk about what's the romantic movement. In that particular lecture, I mentioned the characteristics of the romantic movement and the kind of poetry which Wordsworth brought. Now, in this particular lecture, you will come to know how he defined poetry and what he says about subject matter of poetry. So, the preface contains following arguments. Let me tell you a few things before this. The first edition of Lyrical Ballads or was published in 1998. And this preface begins with a reference to the first edition of Lyrical Ballads. It was first published in 1798, and first edition was a kind of experiment to ascertain the extent to which the real language of men in a state of vivid sensation could impart the pleasure expected from the poetry. The very beginning or the beginning of the Paraphrase to Lyrical Ballads establishes the fact, or it has established the fact that Wordsworth was writing a different kind of poetry, different from the kind of poetry written by the new classical school. And that poetry was popular at that time, and it is still popular. Remember, Wordsworth's friends advised him to give an introduction to his poems so that the aims and objective of his experiment could be made clear. When he got its poems published in Paraphrase in Lyrical Ballads, so of course it was the poems were totally different from the previous era. So his friends advised him or suggested him to give an introduction to the poems so that the aims and objectives of his experiment could become clear. Because the poems were of a new kind, different from the, the generally appreciated works of by critics. And that is why it was very much necessary to offer a kind of defense of the theory on the basis of which the poems were written. It is said that Wordsworth was reluctant to write a paraphrase for many reasons. In the first place, he might be suspected of trying to reason his readers into linking his poems by offering a defense of them. In the second place, it is said that the opinions and views to be included in a paraphrase needed longer space than would be proportionate for a paraphrase. So he needed more space. A number of matters would have had to be dealt with as his poems were of a new kind. So Wordsworth considered it appropriate that the readers should not be confused by the fausting of them of poems which were never so materially different from what they had been used to. So that is why he wrote Preface to the Lyrical Ballads, and that was published in 1800. The preface contains for the following arguments: the nature of poetry and the poetic process. The nature of poetry and the poetic process. The subject matter of poetry. the style and language of poetry and the place of meter. Who is a poet? Who is a, who is a poet? The characteristics of a poet and the relationship between poetry and science. Means here he is trying to is trying to prove that poetry is superior to other branches of knowledge. So these are the things, main things which we can find in Paraphrase to Lyrical Ballads. Now, here we can see how Wordsworth defined poetry. As you can read the definition is very clear. Poetry is the spontaneous overflow of powerful feelings. It takes its origin from emotions recollected in tranquility. The emotion, this is not motion, the emotions is contemplated. The emotion is contemplated till by a species of reaction. The tranquility gradually disappears and an emotion kindred to that which was before the subject of contemplation is gradually produced. And does itself actually exist in the mind. In this mood, successful composition generally begins, and in a mood similar to this, it is carried on. So this is the definition of Wordsworth poetry. Wordsworth defined poetry in this way, and this is what we can find with the Romantic writers. Poetry is a spontaneous outflow, but there are four stages which we can see in this particular definition. First, it is spontaneous outflow of powerful feeling. Then it takes its origin from emotions recollected in tranquility. Tranquility. Then the emotion is contemplated till a species of reaction. The tranquility gradually disappears, and then an emotion kindred to that which was before the subject of contemplation is gradually produced. And then it's does itself exist in the mind. तो इसको हम देखते हैं किस तरह से तो वो चार process हैं. Let's see. So you can see four stages in poetic process. Number one, observation. So these are four stages. Observation, number one, recollection, number two, contemplation, number three, and imaginative excitement is number four. The poet first observes some objects of nature. He object some object of nature or situation, or he observes phenomena in nature. So he observes something first. Remember, we can find idea everywhere. For poetry, idea is everything, and idea is something that we can find, or even romantics can find anywhere, means everywhere. So first they observe some object of nature, or situation, or phenomena in nature. So poetic expression does not occur at that very moment. It is not what they observe that is not poetry. The observations are carried in the poet's heart. They are carried in the poet's heart. He captures them in his in his art. And the emotions excited by the objects are recollected later on. Again, वो जो emotions excite होते हैं, उभरते हैं उस object को देखकर, तो वो recollect करते हैं later on, बाद में. In moments of tranquility, tranquility means in a very peaceful manner, बहुत पुरसुकून और अच्छे माहौल में अच्छी तरीके से पुरसुकून तरीके से उसको रिकलेक्ट करते हैं. He contemplates on these emotions. वो इमोशंस पर क्या करते हैं, कंटेम्पलेट करते हैं, दोबारा उस पर गौर फिक्र करते हैं. कॉन्सिक्वेंटली द अर्लियर इमोशंस आर रिवाइव, तो पहले के जो इमोशंस होते हैं वो रिवाइव हो जाते हैं. And he is once again in a similar emotional excitement to what he experienced when he first saw the object. तो दोबारा से उसी स्टेज पे पहुंच जाता है. It is then the poetic creation takes place, और इसके बाद जो है poetic creation जो है वो होता है. वो poetic creation जो है वो take place करता है. So the emotions which are revived are clear of the accidentals or of the earlier emotions. So उसमें जो bad emotions, they are then they get away, or they are suppressed, and good emotions come to the surface. So the poet first looked at nature. His emotions are aroused, and then in tranquility he recalls his emotions. These emotions are made into a poem with the help of images of those things in nature which arouse the poet's emotions in the first place. So, poetry is a process of communication, and communication takes place in the sphere of notions, not that of ideas. तो ये था पोइटिक प्रोसेस, दैट देर आर 4 stages ऑफ पोइट्री. चौथे स्टेज पे जाकर वो पोइट्री की शक्ल इख्तियार करता है, बट अदर ऑल दीज स्टेजेस आर इम्पॉर्टेंट. First stage is freedom, where the poet observes. Second stage, where the poet recollects, दोबारा से, and bad things get away and good things come to the poet, and then contemplate. Here he rethinks, and the fourth one is production of the production of poetry. Okay, if you talk about Wordsworth's aim, main aim or purpose, so we can find that his main aim was to attack. He attacked the gaudiness and inane phraseology of contemporary poets. As I told you, that contemporary poets were writing and they were paying more attention to style and form rather than subject. And they were using the language which was not the language of real common men. They were using the language which was artificial language, or which was difficult to understand or stylish. So it was a reaction against the belief, not only that some modes of diction were best avoided in poetry, but that other modes were spec- uh, specially suitable. They were other modes were especially suitable. Wordsworth's main aim in writing the poems has been to choose the incidents and situations of common life and to relate them in selection of the language really used by men. Remember, selection of the language really used by men. Wordsworth says that poetry is a matter of communication. It is a matter of communication, and there is no need to use a special language for poetry. The language of poetry should be the same as that of prose. Wordsworth had adopted the language of the humble and rustic people after purifying it of slang and coarse expressions, faulty syntax, and other drawbacks. He has chosen this big language because the humble people living in close proximity with nature, they are very close to nature, hourly communicate with the best objects from which the best part of human language is originally derived. So the hourly communicate means they very often communicate with the best objects from which the best part of human language is originally derived. तो सिंपल लैंग्वेज जो लोग सिंपल लोग बोल रहे होते हैं, तो इसने उस लैंग्वेज का इंतखाब किया. According to Wordsworth, they communicate their feelings and emotions through simple, unelaborate and unsophisticated expressions. यानी कि वो अपनी फीलिंग का इजहार जो है वो मुबालगा आराई या अनसोफिस्टिकेटेड जो मुश्किल एक्सप्रेशन से नहीं करते, सिंपल अल्फाजों में वो सब कुछ करते हैं. Their language is more passionate, clearer, and more forceful and permanent than the arbitrary and capricious habits of expressions of poets working according to an artificial poetic diction. The earlier poets, in order to cater to the fickle and depraved public taste, separated themselves from the language of common men. They stopped using, or they did not use much, the language of common men. So that's why we can, Wordsworth's theory of the language of poetry is known as well as highly controversial. He was the first poet to emphasize a departure from a separate language of poetry and to insist on the need to get nearer to the common man. It is said about Wordsworth that he was right to feel that with a change in the themes of poetry, which was showing greater and greater association with nature, there should be, or there should be a change in language as well. So the poet, according to Wordsworth, is not an isolated being writing about things far above the head of an average human being. The subject of poetry should be simple. And then he talks about the subject of poetry. He said that it should be simple and plain. Artificial diction. The use of artificial devices means that the poet is not confident of his art. According to Wordsworth, if a poet is using artificial devices, it means he is not confident of his art. And the use of artificial diction and other stylistic devices spoil the sublimity and greatness of poetry. According to Wordsworth, the use of poetic diction is equally unnatural in those parts of a composition in which the poet speaks in his own person. Remember, Wordsworth comes to the conclusion, or he concludes, that there is no essential difference between the language of prose and that of metrical composition. Means the language of prose and poetry are closely related in their nature, function, and appeal. They originate from the same sources and appeal to the same faculties. The passions and feelings which a poet conveys through his poetry are not different from the passions and feelings of other ordinary men. A poet's language cannot be different from that of other men who feel clearly and see clearly. According to Wordsworth, poets do not write for poets alone, but for men. When Wordsworth said there is no essential difference between the language of poetry and prose, so Coleridge makes a number of critical remarks regarding Wordsworth's poetry of the language of poetry and regarding this statement. According to Coleridge, there is an essential difference between the language of poetry and prose, and that difference is meter. Coleridge points out that though the words of prose and poetry are common, but their arrangement is different. And Coleridge also remarks that meter is necessary for poetry. Meter is an artificial device, so why should one not adopt other artificial devices? According to Coleridge, Wordsworth also claims this thing that his own, sorry, College also claims this thing that Wordsworth's own poems such as Trenton Abbey and the Immortality Ode do not support this his contention, and there is no essential difference between the language of prose and that of metrical composition. Wordsworth says that the language of prose and poetry they both are closely related in their nature, function, and appeal. They originate from the same sources and appeal to the same faculties. The same human blood, according to Wordsworth, runs through the veins of both poetry and prose. Means he's just here giving example, एक मिसाल दे रहा है कि एक ही चीज़ उन दोनों के रगों में दौड़ रही है, पोइट्री एंड प्रोज. तो वो तो हम भी कह सकते हैं कि वर्ड्स तो सेम ही है, बट ऑफ कोर्स आई हियर अग्री विद Coleridge that the arrangement is different. Words are same. The same words are can be used in poetry and prose both, but their arrangement is something that is different, and that is called the use of meter. Now let's talk about themes and subject matter of poetry. Themes chosen from humble and rustic life. Wordsworth expresses his main purpose in having writing the poem with reference to the choice of subject and language. He said that his subject has been incidents and situations from common life. He has related them in a selection of language really used by men. At the same time, he said that the poet throws over them a coloring of imagination. A poet should use here imagination. That is why it is not photographic realism. The imaginative coloring given with the ordinary incidents will make them appear in an unusual light. He has striven to make these incidents and situations interesting by tracing in them the primary laws of human nature. Primary laws of human nature. ये एक term है, याद रखिएगा इसे. Wordsworth chose or he chooses humble and rustic life. When we read his poetry, we find that he chooses or he has chosen humble and rustic life. Why? Of course, Wordsworth says that in rustic life, it is the in rustic life the essential patience of the human heart finds. Remember, the essential patience of the human heart find a free, unrestrained, plain, and powerful expression. दिस इज़ अ वेरी इंपॉर्टेंट पॉइंट टू रिमेंबर कि जो रस्टिक लाइफ है उसमें आपको ये सब चीज़ें मिलेंगी विद द एसेंशियल पेशेंस ऑफ द ह्यूमन हार्ट and these things find a free, unrestrained, without any restriction, plain and powerful expression. In rustic life, the feelings are simpler, and therefore are more forcefully expressed. The manners of rustic life are simpler and therefore are more easily understood and more durable. जो उसके manners है वो भी simple है और इसके अलावा इसी की वजह से easily understood किए जाते हैं. The passion of men are closely connected with beautiful and permanent forms of nature. Beautiful and permanent forms of nature से उनका connection होता है. Then he talks about, uh, you know, reasons why he chose uh, them. So there are following. These are the reasons why he chose them. The essential patience of the heart find in rustic life, the essential patience of the heart find a better soil in which they can attain their maturity. In the humble state of life, there is free and frank expression of these feelings in the condition of life governing the rustics. The second one, in rustic life, let me number them. It will be better if I number them. In the second, in the rustic and life, the elementary feelings of the human heart coexist in a state of greater simplicity, and it leads to a greater accuracy and forcefulness of communication. It is something that brings about accuracy and forcefulness of communication. The third one is, in rustic conditions, human patients are incorporated with the beautiful and permanent forms of nature, means external nature, and therefore the patients are ennobled and more prominent than those of the sophisticated people of cities, as we can see with the new classical era, writers of new classical era. The fourth one is, the passion of men are closely connected. The manners of the rural folk germinate from those elementary feelings and from the necessary character of the rural occupations, which are more easily understood and are more lasting. Wordsworth's purpose was to understand human nature and to communicate this understanding to his readers. For this proper understanding of the essential human nature, it was very important to go to the simple and humble life of the rustic, to use or to observe the simple and humble life of the rustic people. If we summarize it, so we can say that Wordsworth says that in rustic life, the essential feelings and passions, the elementary feelings resulting as they do from a communion with nature, are simple, unsophisticated, and easy to understand. In in this paraphrase, Wordsworth speaks to men, not to a civilization settled in its patron. And remember, according to Wordsworth, poetry is a spontaneous overflow of powerful feelings. So this definition is different from the previous one. And for this kind of poetry, he had to choose humble and rustic life. And that is why he chooses humble and rustic life, characters from such life. It is also said that Wordsworth himself does not adhere to his theory of the language of poetry in several of his poems. In the language of Tinton Abbey and Immortality or Rustic in any way. Ask critic, it is true that Wordsworth does not always follow his theory in practice. But on the other hand, there are a number of poems like Lucy Gray, The Solitary Rapier, Michael, etc., in which one cannot find any fault with Wordsworth as far as following his own theory of simple language is concerned, and of course, humble and rustic life. In short, or in short, we can say that Wordsworth, according to Wordsworth poetry, is a matter of communication. Poetry is a spontaneous overflow of powerful feeling. It is a matter of communication, and a poet is a man speaking to man. The language of poetry should be simple and not artificial. It should be the language of common man, and that's why he said that a poet is a man speaking to man. The main aim of poetry is to give pleasure. The primary aim or the chief aim or the main aim of poetry according to Wordsworth is to give pleasure. When people gets get pleasure, then they will pay according to them attention to instructions. But if they do not get pleasure and you want them to you want to instruct them, so it is not possible. Poetry is a matter of feeling, and if there is no feeling, no emotions, there is no romantic poetry. So romantic poetry especially deals with emotions and feelings, and it is a revolt against the 18th century poetry. It is a revival of meters and old English masters. So this is what we have about uh, the topic which I have mentioned: definition of poetry and subject matter of poetry. So it's important, and it's important from your examination point of view as well. So I would like all of you to go through it, and I will also inshallah send you मैं कोशिश करके इस किताब से ही इमेज पिक्चर्स लेके आप लोगों को सेंड कर देता हूँ, ताकि जिसने किताब नहीं खरीदी है तो कम से कम वो इन इमेजेस को ही देख ले. फर्स्ट थिंग इज़ दैट यू शुड बाय द बुक. आप लोगों को किताब खरीद लेनी चाहिए. अब अगर आप लोगों ने नहीं खरीदी है तो अफसोस की बात है. मैं इमेजेस भेजूँगा, कम से कम इनको आप देख लें. तो इसके बाद एक लेक्चर और है वर्ड्सवर्थ का जो आपको दिया जाएगा, एंड देन ऑफ कोर्स वी हैव कॉलेज पे ज़्यादा डिटेल नहीं है हमारे पास. 2 लेक्चर में मेरे ख्याल से या 3 लेक्चर में 2 लेक्चर में उसका काम हमारा हो जाएगा 2 सेशन में. एंड देन वी हैव मैथ्यू आर्नल्ड्स 1 ऐसे, और टी एस एलियट को भी हम एक ऐसे करेंगे, दूसरे ऐसे को हम नहीं करेंगे. तो देखेंगे कितना हमारे पास टाइम उस लिहाज से इंशाल्लाह वी विल गो विद इट. So if you have any question, you can ask me. So you can also ask your question when I stop the recording, so that we cannot have very heavy video. तो उसके बाद भी आप पूछ सकते हैं सवालात. You can ask me your questions. It is better to ask questions when you listen to the session. और अगर बाद में सवाल जवाब करेंगे पूछेंगे तो उसमें आपको प्रॉब्लम हो सकती है. So kindly try to ask questions when I finish the lecture, so that things can be easy for you to understand. इस डेफिनेशन को याद रख लीजिएगा. ये डेफिनेशन बहुत पोइट्री की एम है, और इसमें 4 प्रोसेस का जिक्र है. ये जो प्रोसेस यहाँ पे आपको बताए गए कि पहला प्रोसेस जो है उसमें ऑब्जर्वेशन का है. द सेकंड प्रोसेस ऑफ रिकलेक्शन. द थर्ड प्रोसेस इज कंटेम्पलेशन, एंड द फोर्थ वन इज इमेजिनेटिव एक्साइटमेंट, और इट इज़ ऑल्सो कॉल्ड द फोर्थ वन इज कंपोजिशन. मैं लिख देता हूँ यहाँ पर. लेट मी राइट इट. इसको इमेजिनेटिव एक्साइटमेंट या ऑब्जर्वेशन, रिकलेक्शन, कंटेम्पलेशन और कंपोजिशन ही कर देते हैं इसको. कंपोजिशन मतलब जो फोर्थ प्रोसेस है उसमें आप कंपोज करते हैं पोइट्री को, जो है पोइट्री लिख लेते हैं आप, तो इसीलिए वो कहलाएगा कंपोजिशन. और इमेजिनेटिव एक्साइटमेंट मतलब इमेजिनेटिव आप में एक्साइटमेंट आ जाती है, तो आप इसको कंपोजिशन कह देंगे तो ज़्यादा आसानी हो जाएगी आप लोगों के लिए. So with this, I end the session. Thank you very much. I'll be looking for your questions.